Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff I Never Told You, a production of iHeartRadio. And it is time for another edition of Female First, which means we are once again joined by the terrific, the astounding Yves. Welcome, Yves.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here again.
Yes, we are happy to have you because you are very busy. You're doing a lot of traveling. Mm-hmm. I was thinking about this. Every time we talk to you, you sound like you could be a person we're talking about one of these episodes. All the stuff
don't flatter me. I don't need ego inflation. I'm trying to stay chill here, Anney.
I can't help it, Yves. I'm always like, what? Your cat sitting where?
Right. You're traveling the country. Amazing.
Yes. Are there any cool things that stand out you'd like to share with the listeners about what you've been doing, where you've been going?
So I've gone so far to Tennessee and Kentucky. And that was really nice because for better or for worse, the weather was definitely a little bit unseasonably warm. And so I loved that because I am camping out of the car. I have been living out of a rooftop tent, partially, and I've been in homes other times during my travels, but mostly we have our rooftop tent to be able to stay wherever we like to, where we camp. And let me think, you know what? I really loved, this is going to sound so basic, but I really loved one of the nights that I was in Tennessee and Kentucky, and I got to camp by the lake. And at night, so many places in this forested area of the country are like, there's a lot of arbor, there's a lot of tree coverage. So it's hard to have really beautiful views and be out in places and it not be covered by trees. Unfortunately, it's winter, so there isn't as much foliage right now. But, when I stay a place and I get to look up at the stars at night, there's a little skylight at the top of the tent and I get to just look up at the stars. That was really lovely. And I think I might have talked about it before here. In the place where we were at, there was a planetarium, and no matter what the program is, I do love going to planetariums. Like it's just fun to me. I love it. I love the focus on the night sky. And so I got to do that. That was a highlight for me. And also West Virginia was a big highlight for me. So I haven't spent a lot of time in West Virginia. And when I did pass through, I would say on my way to other places, I would say that I wanted to stay there for a longer time. And it's just a really gorgeous landscape. I love the water and the mountains, all the foliage. It's in fall. There were some really pretty colors when I was there, and the Black history that's there. I really appreciated learning in the area where I was at New River Gorge about the history of Black people, the Black churches that were started there, the Black communities that were started there, the Black miners that were there in the early 1900s, and the diversity of miners and people who came there for work in general, although it was a lot of environmental degradation involved in the work that they were doing. Yeah, I mean, I could go on forever, y'all, and I'm not going to because we have a whole episode to get to today with another fascinating woman with other fascinating history. But, I'll be talking about that stuff in other, ways, in other places if you're interested in hearing about that, like on social media and stuff. But I really enjoyed the mix of the beautiful natural landscapes, the history that I get to learn about, and the people. The people have been so hospitable in my travels so far. So yeah, that's the short of what I have been enjoying and been grateful for in this trip thus far.
It sounds amazing. And I'm sure we'll do check-ins to see what else you've been up to. But Samantha and I both love stars and planetariums. So you're, yes.
Talking to the right people.
In good company.
Yes, you're speaking our language. Well, you do have a very fascinating person you brought to us today, Yves. Who are we talking about?
Yes, I'm so excited for this episode. So today we're talking about Amrita Sher-Gil, and she was the first Indian to have artistic training in Paris. And I'm gonna just be honest with y'all right up front. I I really wanted to talk about her, and this is technically a first for her, but to me, you know, it's a good reason to talk about her. Even that first seems kind of dubious because a lot of the times with the first, when I'll be going through lists and trying to find people's first will be centered around like their accomplishments once they went to the West, if they didn't live in Europe or in the Americas. Like they were the first in going to like a Western university. So I try to stay away from things like that. So although this is a technical first for her, she had artistic training in Paris. It's not like the be all end all and the greatest part of her body of work and what she did for art and modern art.
Yes, that's an excellent point. And I'm very glad because a lot of times, people see a first and I feel like they just move on and that's just their story. But this is such a great story that I didn't know. And so I'm always glad when you bring those. You're like, here's the first, but here's the whole of who this person was beyond that.
Yeah, and she was a person, like she was a full person. So Amrita was born in Budapest, Hungary on January 30th, 1913. Her father was Umrao Singh Shergill, and he was a Sikh scholar of Sanskrit and philosophy. He was also a photographer, so he took a lot of self-portraits. He took portraits of the family. That was a big part of what he was enthusiastic about. And Amrita's mother was Hungarian, and her mother's name was Marie Antoinette Gottesman. Marie Antoinette was part of a wealthy family, so that's a big part of Amrita's story. It's a lot of wealth, a lot of stature, politicians in her story, money, homes that have names. You go through somebody's story, you see somebody's home, like, yeah, we call the home the home. It's like, we got a little wealth and money that we're talking about when the homes start having names and stories. So she traveled all over the world. You'll see that wealth and people of stature and importance being a part of her social lifestyle and being in the wealthy elite is a part of her story and definitely part of the access that she had to resources and education and how she was able to move a little bit more freely and independently in her story. So Marie Antoinette, Amrita's mother, described her this way, quote, "She was a beautiful baby with black silky hair reaching down to her neck and big eyes which seemed to survey the world with queer astonishment," end quote. So there was an article written when Amrita was less than 2 months old. And in that article, the writer talked about how, speaking of wealth, the family's house had nice leather chairs, paintings by notable Hungarian artists, lots of books, nice sculptures and pictures in ornate frames. And when we see in stories like this, when people are surrounded by these kinds of cultural items, it's a good place for, as a child, you to draw inspiration. So even before you may be conscious of what you want to do in your career or what you want to do in your life's path, you're just naturally surrounded by these things. So they envelop you, they encompass the things that you do, and your parents also have these leanings. And Amrita's parents were also huge influences in her path in art. So her younger sister, Indira, was born in 1914. And in this environment of Budapest, it was lots of museums, theaters, universities. So it was high cultural experiences that she was able to have there and surrounded by. But when World War I broke out and the money that the family was getting from India was getting kind of tight, they left Budapest and they went to another town that was not that far from Budapest. And it was here that Amrita settled into village life on the banks of the Danube. And when she was just 5 years old, as her mother describes, she started drawing with colored pencils. Her mom noted how well she would draw all of the toys that were around her. And it was here that she started to get closer to her cousins Viola and Victor Egan. And Victor will come back into her story later. in a quite controversial way. But yeah, when the money got better, they moved back to Budapest and to more luxury in a suite at the Grand Hotel. And various people in the art world would visit her family. And Amrita talked about how her favorite kinds of presents to get when she was young were art materials like drawing paper, color pencils, picture books. But one thing that I really enjoyed that she said, so I'll just stop here for a second to say that there are letters that Amrita wrote to other people and letters that people wrote to Amrita that are available for reading. But in the letters and in some of the writings that she wrote, she talked about how when she would get those picture books, it's like she didn't really care for those the most. She wanted to do the hard part of drawing. So the whole like the adults are going to draw these nice outlines for me and I'm going to color them in this specific way. It's not really the way that I want to do things. Like I want to do things so that I get to express my full creativity and my full, the full breadth of what I'm able to do. So she didn't really like those rigid lines and having to be confined by them, which is pretty symbolic for how she later talks about her experiences and learning from her teachers. So it's in a weird meta way. It's like she was saying this through her expression of not wanting to work and draw that way. She was already saying this thing about like how she would develop in her thought process about how she wanted to create her art. So she, at the time in Hungary, it was super unstable. Rule was authoritative. And then there was the prospect of more hardship and less freedom. And that was part of the reason that her family left for India in January 1921. Still bougie, they stopped in Paris on the way. It's a long trip. Might as well get a little bit of cultural exploration in the middle. So they stopped in Paris, saw things, and then they made it to India in February and eventually to the city known as Simla in northern India in April. So her parents are helping her develop her artistic expression early on. They notice it in her, they recognize it, and so they try to uplift that. They get her an art teacher. But Amrita, knowing what she wants very early on, it seems like she might have been pretty precocious, was like, I'm bored with this guy's methods of teaching. She was like, this is too rigid for me. He's trying to make me do the same thing over and over and do it a way that I don't want to do it. But she still read a lot at this point and she was introverted. And she eventually started to take lessons from another painter, and he was named Hall Bhavan Petman. I think that's how you pronounce it. And he saw a lot of potential in her. He advised Amrita's mother that she should train at the Slade School in London and that she should train in Paris. So Marie Antoinette, her mother, was like, all right, I'm really into uplifting her interest in art, and I'll do a lot of things to do that for her. And her sister Indira, so her and her sister would play piano, dance. So they were involved in other cultural aspects and arts as well. But Marie Antoinette was like, I'm going to take them to Italy, but it's because I'm having an affair with the sculptor who's Italian, under this guise that she was going to expose them to more art and language. So it's not like that didn't happen. That did happen while they were in Italy, but there was this double reasoning for her to go to Italy. But she took them there. And Amrita went to the Santa Annunziata school in Florence. She didn't like it. She didn't like how rigid and how stuck up it seemed. And she thought that it stifled her creatively. But she did like being in Italy, and she learned about the Italian Renaissance masters and got interested in their modes of creating. The family went back to Simla. And there, Amrita started going to another Catholic school, which she didn't like being there either. And Amrita was already, though, capturing the tension in her parents' relationship. So she was very observant. Noticed that about her early work. She notices she seemed pretty, empathetic of what other people were experiencing. And she does these watercolors and drawings. And one, for instance, was of a woman lost in a forest. One was of a woman holding a knife to her heart. And her uncle, Ervin Bakte, was a Hungarian painter and was also an Indologist. And he would visit the family in Simla. And he introduced Amrita to some new tenets of painting, talked about the importance of plein air painting. She started doing these realistic sketches and using live models for her paintings. And she later said that she owed her skill in drawing to him. So the family moved to Paris to support her arts education when she was 16. She got accepted into one school. She did more sketches of the new models that were there. But she didn't want to draw with the most accuracy, and her dad didn't really care for that. There's a quote where he talks about how he saw these other artists who were so faithful to, the figures, their drawings were so accurate, and he was an admirer of that. But that wasn't what she was into. She didn't want to do that. Either way, she was allowed to start taking classes with this post-impressionist professor whose name was Lucien Simon, and he was at the École des Beaux-Arts. Even though she was too young to be admitted there, she was still allowed to take classes with him. Her mother wanted her to be part of this elite social life. She wanted, the fancy get-togethers at home. But Amrita, she kind of wanted to be outside with the seedy art folks. She was interested in that lifestyle. And she had intimate relationships with men and with women. And she painted one of her lovers, whose name was Boris. He was a classmate of hers. And it's also talked about how her mom asked her if she was in a sexual relationship with a close friend of hers whose name was Marie-Louise. And she says, "Mama, I'm not a lesbian, but I can see the benefits." She talks about STIs and unplanned pregnancies. So she was like, "So, I see where you're coming from, but I'm not a lesbian." So in her self-portrait she painted in 1930, she was smiling, wearing red lipstick, lots of colorful bracelets and a necklace, and she looked super carefree and happy. I really like that portrait. By the way, everyone who's listening, y'all can go and see her works online. There are a lot of them, so you can check out her work over time and see how it changed. But yeah, she sees an exhibition by the Bengali artist Rabindranath Tagore in Paris, and she's a fan of his work. She keeps painting portraits of people in the city, and she paints more self-portraits, and she starts spending summers in Hungary with her family. But she has this pull to go back to India. In 1934, she does go back, as she thinks being there will improve her art. Her father didn't want her to go. He felt like her unconventionality would hurt his reputation. And she was like, "I can't believe you would put your reputation over my progress," which is understandable, even though clearly the family did move quite a bit for them to learn more about art. But she said she needed more new sources of inspiration. And even though she had been in Europe for a while, she said that her stay in Europe pushed her to discover more of India. And she started using Indian subjects and themes in her work, but she maintained parts of her European influence and style. And she said that she wanted to be, quote, "an interpreter of the life of the people, particularly the life of the poor and the sad." She loved the frescoes that she saw at Ajanta in Western India. And she met Karl Kandalavala, who became a champion for her work and also a critic of her work, but they were friends for the rest of her life. And she exhibited in what was then called Bombay and Hyderabad. And here's where another female first comes up. She met Sarojini Naidu, who we talked about in a previous episode, who was the first Indian woman to be appointed president of the Indian National Congress. So she's still, rubbing shoulders with famous people and with people who were in politics, who were notable at the time. And she's also having solo exhibitions. So in February of 1937, she had a solo exhibition at a center in a university there in India. And she was becoming well known in the art world there, even though there were times in which she was criticized for the European influence in her work. So here's where Victor Egan comes back into the story. He was her cousin, but in 1938, he became her husband because they got married, and her mother didn't approve of that, ostensibly because it was, a marriage in the family, but also it seemed like she didn't think that he was good enough for her. Like, he was still just studying to be a doctor. Like, he didn't have the kind of influence and stature that she was looking for him. And also, that wasn't just an outside thing. So they got married. I think it was her niece who talked about how people didn't really understand how they were even a match or why she even got married to him. He didn't understand her work, and it seemed like the marriage wasn't that great. There is a point at which Amrita says they're fond of each other, but they don't have anything to say to each other. So they would sit there in silence, like not talking to each other. And then they were like, okay, well, I guess it's time to move on to the next thing. But in 1939, she stays with him. I think there's a quote in which she says, I followed him to where he wanted to go like a good Indian wife. In 1939, she went back to India with Victor in June. And at this time, World War II is beginning. But from the period from that decade, from about 1939, from about 1931 and onwards till her death for about a decade, she created more than 150 paintings. So she was pretty prolific. And her work is being exhibited. So she had this big solo exhibition that was scheduled to open in Lahore on December 16th in 1941. But that didn't happen as planned. Her last painting was this unfinished view from her studio window in Lahore. But she got sick, and her husband, Victor, treated her for dysentery. But she went into a coma, and Victor didn't end up getting a second opinion. And she died on December 5th, 1941. She was only 28 years old at the time. So she had a short life, even though she created a lot of work within that time, and she started very early on. And she got recognition during that time. So that's very notable. An exhibition of her paintings was held in December of that year at Punjab Literary League Hall in Lahore. And she got a lot of posthumous credit as well. So in 1944, Carl Kandalavala wrote a monograph on her. And in 1948, sadly, Amrita's mother, Marie Antoinette, died by suicide. And Amrita's niece also talked about how her sister, Amrita's sister, Indira, also was heavily affected by Amrita's early death and remained pretty sad about it for her life. But her paintings were donated later on. Her dad and brother-in-law donated some to the National Gallery of Modern Art, and her husband also sold some of her paintings. And her family continued to carry on her legacy and document the family history, I think, for themselves, but also share that through their work. So Navina Sundaram and Vivan Sundaram, they created documentaries, books, and artwork about Amrita and her life. They were dedicated to as part of their own personal artistic practices, but also as part of being their family historians and sharing her work and legacy with other people so that they knew about it as well. And also, Amrita's work has gotten a lot of money at auction. She's considered one of the 9 national treasure artists of India. And she's also credited with helping bring in modernism into Indian art. And last year, she set a record for getting the highest ever price for an Indian artwork that was sold at auction. It was sold for $7.45 million. And that was the work, The Storyteller, which it shows this circle of women that are seated next to cows in a garden. And she often, in her work, showed women subjects. As I said from that quote that she had earlier, she was really interested in faithfully documenting, but not like romanticizing the life of people who were living in poverty in India and the people who were just going about their daily duties and working and spending time with their families and loved ones and painting those kinds of scenes. So that is the life of Amrita. She did a lot in a very short period, 28 years, but it's a very, very fascinating story, I think, from all of her travels to her background, to the different influences she had through her being invested and involved in art at such a turbulent time during the World Wars and during her time in Hungary.
Yeah, I love this story. It's amazing that she had such an influence and continues to still have an influence, and her paintings were raking in millions of dollars. But I also love that you brought in the through line in her life seemed to be like she didn't like that. She didn't like the people kept telling her what to do, and she was like, "No, I don't like that." So I'm going to do this own thing. And she made change through doing that. But it's to hear it from such a young age of like, I don't want to color in the lines. I don't want to be like restrained in this way, or this teacher, I don't like how he only teaches me this one thing. It's amazing to see how many times she was like, no, I'm gonna do my own thing, actually.
Yeah. And she said it out loud. Like she was like, yeah, I'm not into that. I'm still going to do it my own way. And this is for the best. She clearly bet on herself. So like even when people outside of her were telling her that this wasn't the best way to do things, or she wasn't going to have the most success doing these things, she still chose to paint that way. She still chose to draw that way. And she wasn't afraid of the consequences. So it seemed like she was like, okay, whatever happens, I'm going to choose to do things this way. Like, for instance, she got expelled from one of the Catholic schools that she was going to. And, you know, it was like, all right, fine. Like, I'm doing these new paintings. I'm doing these new drawings. This is what I choose to do because this is what I want to do. And I'll accept whatever comes after that.
Right. I feel like she was the original bohemian pixie manic girl. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In that level of like a little bit of rebellion, but a lot of wisdom as well, and just really following her instinct. It's kind of like, oh, she really was that girl.
Yeah, well, it's funny you say that because in when I was watching her niece talk about her, she mentioned that a lot of the people in the family were manic. They had manic depression. And she said that what she said was that Amrita was the one who was the most stable of all of them. So I think that might have been comparative because she still said that there was some of that in her, but like compared to her other family members, she was the one who didn't have it as much as they did. But she definitely was all about like going in the opposite direction.
Right. I love that story. It sounds like then that makes a lot more sense of why she got so much leeway into doing those things. If the other people are like, well, it's not as bad as cousin over here, so let her do this. She's
Right.
drawing things. It's wonderful.
Yeah. But it's so, her story is so ripe for dramatizing
Yeah.
because of how romanticized that kind of bohemian lifestyle can be, and Paris at the
Exactly.
time she was there.
Exactly.
And the way she was moving through Paris, because she was bisexual, even though she said to her mom, like, I'm not a lesbian. Yeah. So I think there are so many elements of her story that are so fanciful. And she really was a beautiful person. And if you go and you see the pictures of the home she lived in, like, they just look so nice and idyllic, like the environments that they were in and growing up in the village. And I think this overarching theme of her navigating two different realms, because she was definitely moneyed and definitely walking in these circles with these highfalutin folks, but she was also able to, like, in a way that seemed pretty sincere, speak with and engage with people who lived in villages and also live in village herself, and remain focused on her art and expressing things in an honest and sincere way, and seemingly remaining humble. Yeah. And it's really, I find that when I'm looking at her work, it evinces truly a lot of emotion. Like, I don't know, maybe everyone should just spend a little bit of time just like looking at them, and maybe even look at them before you dig deeper into her story, and see like what feelings arise as looking through them. Because, people still clearly recognize what her work meant to Indian art and what it meant to modern art. And that is beyond their commercial value, because, Sotheby auctions aren't the end all be all of the meaning that should be made from the work that somebody did. So even beyond that, her recognition as this national treasure of India is important. And the work that her family has done in memorializing her is honestly really beautiful too, because I think it was Vivan Sundaram, he has his own artwork as well, but at a point turned really heavily into being this kind of family historian. And that takes a lot of work, especially with someone who has such an extensive family history, an extensively documented family history, because not everybody kept those kinds of letters. Not everybody wrote them, and not everybody held on to them. Not everybody had that photographic documentation of their lives. So it's honestly a really beautiful thing to see how long of a life and how much of an avalanche just that documentation over time, through personal passion, but also through dedication, devotion to documenting, that's really paid off.
Right. I mean, that definitely says a lot too, like how much he was able to foresee the importance of it all. Because most of the times, like in our presence, a lot of times we don't think about it. We don't think about it until like 50 years later or 100 years later, when we have to rediscover it and be like, oh man, if someone had actually foreseen what this could have been, like, and here we have an actual moment of like him loving something and understanding something to its depth and preserving it and making sure that it's told. That's phenomenal.
Yeah, it is.
It is. It is. It's strangely enough, I've thought about this because I'm very sentimental and I save everything like people send me. And I don't know why. I think it's just because of I watch so many horror movies, but I've thought about like if I died or disappeared suddenly, here's what they would have like to piece together who I am. But the thing is, I've also burned things that I didn't like.
I remember that.
So it's like you're kind of in a strange way controlling a narrative that will never happen in my case, but it's just interesting to think about those things that people find and piece together through letters or diaries or what have you, and the story that you're able to, the story of someone's life you're able to get from those things. It is really great.
And I believe Amrita kept a scrapbook as well, and it had clippings of the articles about her in it. And yes, it makes me think about what I should keep and what I don't keep, because I like to keep things too. And like, since I've been traveling, I'm like, oh, should I keep this entry ticket? Should I keep this map? Like, no, it's just a pretty disposable piece of paraphernalia. Like, it's just a map. But like, is it just a map? It tells part of the story too. Should I keep this receipt? Like little things like that. So yeah, it is something that is interesting to think about.
Well, it's also in a trope in a lot of games I play, like horror games, is you find the notes. And then they're like, oh no, the zombie. Like,
yeah.
Yes.
So,
well,
you're talking about the survival horror video games, aren't you?
Yes. I was thinking absolutely like The Last of Us and The Last of Us 2. But Yves, just to answer your question, yes, you should save everything as you're traveling.
I should.
Put it in put it as a bookmarker in your journal of like those times, because I think that's significant.
Well, I've been an aspirational scrapbooker. I have to tell you, I always say I'm going to put it in there because it'll be somewhere to store it, but I never do it. I never do it.
My mom's the only scrapbooker I know, and she does pretty well. It makes me sad because I realize how little stuff that I did sometimes, and I'm like, oh, my scrapbook is 4 pages. Nice. I'm just kidding. But yeah, scrapbooking is a chore. It is. It's a commitment.
I did them for like things I loved. Yeah.
You did do it?
Oh yeah.
There has to be someone willing to hold on to this scrapbook after you're gone.
Well,
That's the thing. I'm like, I'm going to put all this energy into this. Is anybody going to care about it when I'm gone?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you so much, Yves, for coming on. We know you're busy traveling all over, so thank you. We really appreciate it. We always love having you on.
Thank you. Yeah, I love sharing these stories.
They're great. They're so good. Where can the good listeners find you?
Y'all can find me. You can go to Instagram. I'm there at Not Apologizing. You can also go to my website, which is yvesjeffcoat.com. That's spelled YVESJEFFCOAT.com. And from there, you can find links out to other things. So you can also sign up for my newsletter if you go to just like the pop-up on that page or go to my contact page on my website. You can also find me as a co-host of the podcast On Theme, which is a show about Black storytelling. And you can find me on many other episodes of Stuff Mom Never Told You, talking about female first. And yeah, just as I mentioned earlier in the episode, if you're interested in my travels and the history and natural things that I've been doing along the way, then you can find that stuff on Instagram, and there'll be links out to other places to find that too there.
Yes, definitely go do that, listeners. And if you would like to contact us, you can. Our email is stephanie@momstuff@iheartmedia.com. You can find us on Twitter @momstuffpodcast or on Instagram and TikTok @Stuff I'll Never Told You. We're on YouTube, we have a TeePublic store, and we have a book you can get wherever you get your books. Thanks, as always, to our super producer, Christina, our executive producer, Maya, and our contributor, Joey.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for listening. Stuff I'll Never Told You is a production by iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can check out the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.